tips for writing libraries. In truth, I am Mark, and I am here to talk to you about tips for writing libraries. And for the purposes of this presentation, my focus is going to be on libraries for public distribution. It doesn't have to be open source, be proprietary, and then whether the library itself is providing local values, maybe it is an API to make it easier for other applications to integrate with your on-device application. Maybe your API is purely a local one accessing some back-end web server. What I'm talking about here today isn't quite as great of a match for libraries for internal use within organizations and so forth, though some aspects of what I'll be talking about here surely will be relevant there. At the end of the day, it's really a question of the size of your audience. And hey, I'm louder now. It's amazing how that works. Now, a quick operational note that there will be a URL and a QR code at the end for you to grab these slides. Now, you need to take pictures along the way. Quick show of hands, how many of you were here in this room the previous time slot for Ty Smith's presentation on building Android SDKs? Awesome. The way I usually do these conferences is that when I submit papers or ideas for presentations, I usually submit a handful of ideas and I say, hey, pick one. Accidentally, we wound up where Ty and I pretty much were talking on the same subject. And so we're doing a little fanciful work in order to try to minimize the duplication. That being said, there's going to be a bit of overlap here and there. Mostly it'll be in areas where it would be really cool if you were paying attention to what we were advising. But for those of you who weren't here, definitely grab Ty's slides. He's promised that he'll be tweeting them early next week. And that he went through the basics of setting up your own sort of SDK in terms of your API design, making sure that you can be adaptive to changes in terms of permissions, device features that your library may depend upon, but may or may not exist at runtime based upon developer preferences and the user's end device. The sorts of characteristics that your API should have, your impacts on performance, or hopefully your non-impact on performance, documentation, distribution concerns as well. And so his presentation was awesome and well worth grabbing his slide. Or coming to another conference where he's delivering it. Yeah, he's up for an DevCon San Francisco later this year. But his presentation tended to be focused a lot on the things that you should be doing and accentuating the possible. I'm all about the problems. Partly, because my last name is Murphy, and problems happen. Partly it's from my experiences. I've answered at this point in time slightly over 13,000 answers out on Stack Overflow. Yeah. You're welcome. And that's 13,000 times that some developer went and said, why? Trying to figure out how to make something work. And in many of those cases, it was from some library. And those basically, they're to some extent, they're the one-star ratings for the APIs and for the libraries. And so we're trying to figure out what can I tell you from the experiences of helping them, from the experiences from my own libraries that can help you in creating yours. These are organized into a few different levels, and then we'll start off on some tactical things. Think Big Tent. Yes, you're probably using Android Studio if you're attending a conference like this. Yes, many of your teammates may be using Android Studio. There's a whole lot of people out there who are going to be using Eclipse not only today, but for a long time. Ty mentioned the issues in that of simply Android Studio being beta. A lot of organizations are hesitant to move over to a beta toolkit. But there's also language considerations to take into account. The technologies that are released in a largely English language dominated ecosystem, it takes time for that knowledge to percolate through and get out to developers whose native language may not be English. And so it will be some time, and that before the whole world has moved over to Android Studio. Therefore, as you're designing your libraries, you want to make sure that they're going to be used by all available IDEs. They're going to be able to be used by at least the two big ones of Eclipse and Android Studio. If you are doing an open source project, this is going to lean you in the direction of trying to stick with the legacy project structure, where your res and your source and whatnot are underneath the project root, as opposed to and preventing you from using the source sets that you might get with Gradle for Android and Android Studio. But, again, your job is to try to be compatible wherever possible, and then make sure that you're going to be able to support all of those people. Try to make sure that you're going to allow them to be able to theme your stuff if you're doing UI things, and that whether it is a simple widget, whether you're providing stock activities that they're going to be using, particularly here with material design, it's going to be really important for the third parties, the users of your library, to be able to go in and make your UI elements look like the rest of their application so that it all seems seamless. And therefore, you're going to need to, get good with your styles, your themes, making sure that those can be overridden. And that's similarly in terms of language. If you are using strings, and that make sure that there is some means by which those authors are going to be able to go in and augment your translations for the languages that maybe you aren't in a position to maintain, that they need to maintain because they're distributing your apps now. Now, another issue with Ty's presentation was that he was, again, accentuating the positive. And therefore he wasn't doing too much in the naming and shaming area, other than that, that one unfortunate top listing, this is new, and that this is a rough and tumble, hard-nosed city, so therefore I'm feeling that it's really important to be able to point out some anti-backings as well. So, from time to time, I'm going to point out places where, people don't necessarily follow the rules. And that I suck at styles and themes. I am lousy with those. And I need to do a better job. I need to go in and, for a couple of my libraries, I have a dozen or so libraries called Commons for Android components. I need to be able to go in and do more with them. There is an outstanding Stack Overflow question from about 12 hours ago, and that where somebody is trying to use my backport of the media route action provider. For those of you who maybe tried integrating with Chromecast, the media route action provider they want you to use depends upon the app compat action bar, which is cool, but what if you don't want to use the app compat action bar? You want to use the native action bar. They don't really have support for that. So I effectively cross-ported the media route action provider that is designed for app compat to make it available to work on the native API level 11 action bar. Except I've obviously screwed something up, and that where somehow the way that this one gentleman is integrating my library, that somehow I'm stomping all over his theme. I'm not quite sure how. But I need to go in and try to figure that out. And I need to do a better job, particularly with that library, since I'm contributing UI to make sure that I'm keeping up, in this case, with changes to the the media route action provider's own resources for the cast icon, and things like that. So I've got to do a much better job in that area. Be very, very careful about the things you are forcing developers to have to do. It used to be that a lot of libraries said, oh yes, to use my library you have to create a custom subclass of my base application class and use that in your app. And unfortunately that's faded some, but there's still libraries out there that do that. The problem is we don't have multiple inheritance in Java, and there is only one application object in our processes. You can have only one application class. Just because you think that people ought to subclass your application, if everybody says that with all their libraries, now developers can't use two libraries that are both requiring, at most, require an interface, where you need to provide a stock implementation of that, but that there are other ways that the developer could go in and satisfy that interface that does not require them to directly inherit from some magic class of yours. Similarly, try not to require a magic theme. Maybe supply a theme that they can use as a starter point in order to be able to simplify integrating your library, but don't force them to use that. there's going to be other dependencies, there's going to be other requirements of their theme, particularly as we get more into material design, and we got to get more serious about choosing color palettes and all of that. And so the fewer requirements you put on the developer who's using your library to say, oh, you've got to use this thing or else, the better off you'll be. If you're offering some sort of in-memory caching, there's going to be other caches in that app. And there's going to be other libraries that are going to do caching. The developer may have their own caches. Don't assume that you are the only cache. Don't assume that you can just use, a third of the RAM heap space of that. Because if there's 4 libraries that all think they can use a third of the heap space, that doesn't work. And so make sure that you at least allow make your cache be configurable. Where possible, try to make it so that the caching can be shared. Similar for other resource pools, like thread pools. If every library thinks that it can have its own thread pool with a bunch of threads in it, now all of a sudden we've got tons of threads that are all trying to compete for a modest number of cores. Try to allow the developer to supply you with a thread pool executor that you'll rely upon, defaulting to your own implementation. If you don't, if the developer chooses not to supply one. You can do some ProGuard work on the library that you're shipping, but at the end of the day, some aspects of it are going to wind up having to be controlled at the app level, particularly in terms of obfuscation. You've got to make sure that people who are integrating your libraries know that you are dependent upon certain classes, certain methods having consistent names, but you can't let ProGuard go in there and mangle them into something unreadable, because otherwise your code will break. The more guidance you can provide the developers that are using your library on that, tell them, oh, you need these keep directives in your ProGuard configuration file. Providing them a ProGuard configuration file they can chain in with the others, the better off it's going to be for them to be able to not only have your app work in debug mode, but to be able to ship effectively. Manifest merging becoming a lot more important, particularly for those who are using Android Studio and Gradle for Android. Manifest merging's gotten a whole lot more sophisticated of being able to blend in libraries and what they put in their manifests, stitch them all together into one master-generated manifest, along with what the developer has in their manifest, and their product flavors manifests, and their build types manifests, and everything else they may have at the app level. You're going to need to think through, okay, make sure that you only have things in your library's manifest that really ought to be there. Just because you had some manifest that you had copied into there at the beginning when your project was set up, double check all the values in there. Are they the sorts of things that you really do want to have be considered for merging into the top level manifest? Be easy on the logging. Maybe you take the approach that I recommended and you provide a pluggable logging interface so that developers who want to do their own logging can supply you with some sort of a logger implementation. But regardless, and that's, please ease up on flooding the logs. In particular, thinking that everything is an error, and that's not a good plan. It's bad enough that we're flooded with all the manufacturer errors, and yes, I am trying to convince them to stop that too. But bear in mind the libraries, of course, are in the developer's process, and so even a lot of the filtering that we get with Logcat, it's not going to filter out those messages. And so the more you flood them with messages that they can't separate the wheat from the chaff, the more difficult it will be for them to be able to make sense of what's going on in their app with or without your library. Once again, I need to do a little bit more work in this area, particularly on the ProGuard side, and I haven't been doing a good job of providing ProGuard guidance, and I need to add some more stuff to my libraries to make sure that I'm providing those instructions to people. In truth, there's probably not that much that will absolutely be needed. I probably don't have that many magic classes and magic methods that I need certain names for. That being said, I need to double check all of that, make sure that that's part of my release checklist and so forth, so that I'm keeping everybody who's using my library up to speed. If you're providing an open source library, you may be tempted to say, oh, okay, I'll just upload it to GitHub and call it good. Or upload it to your other favorite public repository and call it good. you're welcome to do that. Ideally, you're publishing artifacts somewhere. Could be Maven Central, could be some other Maven style repository, whatever. But it's a lot easier for the developers to be able to go in, particularly with Android Studio and Gradle for Android, add a couple of lines to their build.gradle file, pull down your stuff, be able to find out about updates, dependencies, and so on, and then to have to clone your repo and try to add it as a module, and then deal with any changes that you may make into the way that repo is structured. And if you're bothering to be trying to release a library to the public, make sure they're going to be able to find it somewhere. Not in terms of a repository, but in terms of humans. And I mean, how are they going to find you? They're going to find you just through a Google search. They're going to find you through sites like the Android Arsenal, collections of open source and proprietary libraries. How are they going to know that your libraries exist? It doesn't do you any good. I mean, if a library existed in the web and nobody downloaded it, is the library really there? I'm a lousy self-promoter, and that's just not my makeup, and so I haven't been doing much, particularly on the promotion side, in order to let people know that these libraries exist. I need to do a better job of that and make sure that I am in the Android Arsenal and things of that nature. Make sure you've got adequate instruction. This is what trips up most of those people who are trying to make sense of your stuff and are coming to Stack Overflow asking for help. There's questions showing up every day, and that where the question really written, and that what pretty much boils down to, I can't figure out how to use this library, please help. That's difficult to handle, as from a support standpoint, and it's going to be difficult for anybody else to be able to help them if the documentation isn't there. Have a well-written README. Consider some sort of wiki or more expanded documentation if appropriate. Consider Java docs, and have samples, sample apps, code snippets in the README, etc., to make it easy for people to be able to figure out, okay, this is how this really works in practice, as opposed to just trying to rock a bunch of Java docs and guess the proper way the methods get plugged together. Using open source, have an open source license. Don't just throw code into a GitHub repo. If there's no license, technically we have no right to use your code. It's copyright law here in the States since '76. Everything's automatically copyrighted. And that, adding a license, not that hard. GitHub, automatically can add a license for you. Make sure the license file is there, add the appropriate lines to your source file headers and so forth. Make sure that we understand the rules of the game for how we're supposed to be able to use your library. Make sure you tell people how to get support. Where are they supposed to be asking questions? Is it Stack Overflow? Is it some Google group? Is it some Google Plus community? Is it something else? Are you running a publication tracker? What sorts of things go in the issue tracker versus things that go elsewhere? Make sure that you're providing guidance for how people can help you help them. But bear in mind, people aren't going to pay attention to you all the time. The questions will come to Stack Overflow, and that whether you're telling them there's another support point or not, because they're going to go to the tools that they're used to using for questions, and if they're used to asking in Stack Overflow, they'll ask about your library in Stack Overflow as well. So you want to set up the appropriate filters and whatnot on Stack Overflow so you can get emailed when questions come in that seem to be pertaining to your particular library. If you're trying to steer people that the issue tracker is only for issues, you'll get questions in your issue tracker too. It's just kind of the way it is. And that steer them in the right direction, and that, but be willing to try to help them, and that no matter what the venue. But of course, not everything is at a pure tactical level. And that there are some things you're going to need to think about really before you get to any of that tactical stuff, higher order issues, and that is you are setting up that library. Ty talked about having clean APIs, easy ways to initialize, builder patterns, things like that. At the high level, what you want to do is you want to find what the current ways of designing these APIs are and try to follow those patterns. And the easiest way to do that is to find some sort of an API master, somebody who has a good reputation for creating well-designed APIs, and do what they do. Square is a classic example of this. And then they publish a bunch of libraries, and on the whole, their APIs are usually fairly good. Not perfect, nobody is. But, it's pretty decent. Their libraries are fairly easy to understand how to at least do the basics. And that's fairly easy to understand what the extension points are if they exist and so forth. This does not mean that you should be going out and, since there's a lot of Square presenters here, and that kidnapping one of them, bringing them back to your office, chaining them to a chair, and then forcing them to tell you how it works. Just collect a DNA sample and clone it. Partly, I don't really want to be cloned. Orphan Black scenarios get weird. But beyond that, I don't claim to be especially good at designing APIs. I try. I'm getting better. I certainly wouldn't be using myself as a model, and that I would be turning more towards the Squares, the Crashlytics, and other people in that who seem to have more of a natural feel for that. I am clumsy, but I try. When you're trying to figure out the scope of your library, avoid kitchen sink libraries. By which I mean something that's all-encompassing. It's this library, it slices, it dices, it waxes your car, everything you can think of. Play Services SDK, classic example. Jake Wharton has an epic rant and that about how Play Services SDK really should have been busted up into a bunch of individual libraries, but rather instead it's glommed into this one massive thing. That makes it more difficult in many ways for people to use that library. Partly, as Ty pointed out, size scares people. Partly, you're going to run into things like the vexed method count issues, where nowadays, if people are including Google Play Services, there's a pretty decent chance they're not going to be able to have a whole lot of other libraries because they just start hitting those 64K method reference limits. You're going to want to make sure that you can be nimble with the libraries, that you're going to be able to release them when they need to be released, and that there's not some sort of inertia that is saying, okay, well, we don't want to release this thing because, we're tweaking this one little corner of the library, but that means we've got to do all this extra work for release stuff for all the rest of this library, and gosh, therefore we aren't going to want to release, we're going to want to wait to release since we get a lot bigger stuff. And therefore, themes, bug fixes, enhancements, and that could benefit the developers using your library, they don't get shipped until critical mass is achieved. And the bigger your library, the bigger that critical mass tends to be. Instead, have focused libraries that solve a particular problem. And to the extent that they need each other, make sure that you've just got the dependencies set up. Whether it is stuff that's to be used as dependency management rules for tools like Gradle and Maven that can figure out that libraries depend upon other libraries and help developers consume them, or just solid documentation to say, hey, if you are using this library, you are going to need to do X to download these other dependencies and have them as part of your, let's say, lives directory, and that is in a classic Eclipse or AMP project. But make sure that, to the extent you can, you're going to be better served with a federated family of smaller libraries rather than a battleship. Minimize the dependencies that you are going to be requiring. That, to some extent, may sound like it runs opposite of the recommendations a minute ago. But here I'm referring more towards the dependencies on things that would affect the developer's own app. Yes, you may like Java 8. Not everybody's up on Java 8, and that the end is therefore going to be able to consume your code if you're shipping open source, and therefore you're using operators and so forth that are dependent upon Java 8. If you need certain compile time tools, and that's going to add some additional inertia for people who are trying to maybe reuse your code if this is an open source library. Jake Horton loves guava, if you attended Jake's presentation earlier today. On the other hand, guava is another kitchen sink. And that the SQL Cipher project, I'll be talking more about that a little later today, has a dependency on guava today. They've recently committed to the version control system where they're basically kind of teasing out that because they're only really using a little corner of guava, and guava's got a fairly big footprint. And, you know, there's the, oh, thank God, comments already coming in on making that change from developers who are running into things like that 64K method reference limit, and therefore Guava, removing the Guava dependency will make it easier for them to consume SQL Cipher. Those of you who attended the keynote today, you were given permission to set your min SDK version to 15. Those of you who didn't attend the keynote, sorry, you need to continue to support for IO. But that's for app developers. And that for library developers, the older you can continue to support, the better off you're going to be in terms of adoption. Not everybody is in a position to say min SDK version 15. And that particularly depending upon where the developer is and where the developer's users are. The reason why Gingerbread has been hanging on as long as it has is because it's got a much lower hardware requirements. There was a steep climb with Honeycomb in terms of what you needed, particularly a GPU. You can make a whole lot cheaper phone running Gingerbread. And therefore in emerging markets, you know, a lot of the Gingerbread stuff is because they're trying to make less expensive phones. Initiatives like Android One will help with that, but you know, it's still going to take some time. And so the lower that you can support on the min SDK version, the more, you know, the fewer assumptions you can make about the end target SDK version you wind up with. Those sorts of things are going to help make sure that others are going to be able to integrate your library with success. Bearing in mind, again, particularly with manifest merging, some of the things like the min SDK version and target SDK version you ask for are going to get overridden by the app developer. And so you're going to need to think through, okay, well, what are going to be the ramifications if they do that? Where am I going to break? How can I advise them on how to make that combination work? From a security standpoint, security is important. And that if you are creating a library that is talking to some server, please use SSL. And go beyond that. If you are using your own server, the point behind your library is to talk to your server, like Crashlytics library is designed to talk to Crashlytics servers. Consider doing more things beyond just SSL. And that because, you know, certificate authorities are getting hacked with disturbing frequency. You know, Komodo, Trust, etc. There was a, you know, just in the past month or so, a sub-authority, the Indian authority got hacked, was issuing forged credentials for Google, Yahoo, etc. And so, I mean, to the extent you can with the library, take it the next step, validate the certificate that's coming in. You know what search you're expecting. Pin your library to say, oh, if it's a cert I'm expecting, cool. If it's not, that's an issue. Whether you fail, or because maybe the user is a victim of a Martian in the middle attack, or whether it is something that you merely want to log and report so that you can figure out, well, okay, well, gee, users behind the Great Firewall of China, they are running into problems where people are intercepting the communications. You can then figure out what to do. If your library is designed to hook up to arbitrary servers, you're taking URLs and so forth as input, you're the one who's doing the HTTP connections, make sure that you're exposing the APIs to allow the developers to configure and manage the SSL. You don't know how they want to talk to their server. Maybe they're not using a CA-signed cert, but rather are using a self-signed cert, so that therefore it can't be forged. Maybe they're using a private certificate authority or other things that are going to want to tailor the way that works. Just accept custom trust stores or trust managers as input and just apply them rather than assuming the defaults. It's not that hard, and you're giving additional flexibility so that they can secure things in ways that will help their users defend their data. If your library is designed to help people talk to an app of yours on the Android device, rather than then directly using intents and start service and so forth to talk to your app that you're providing a wrapper. Consider having that wrapper validate that the thing that you're talking to really is your app. Check the public sign-in key that is in the application. Make sure that it is actually you and that it is not some hacked edition of your app. That way, if the user wound up accidentally downloading a version of your app that was hacked by somebody and did wind up with malware, people can find out about it. This is particularly important if you're using services with implicit intents. Services that expose implicit intents can be readily spoofed, and that somebody else can go in and publish the same service with a similar intent filter with a higher priority, or they got installed first. They're going to be the one that the client app talks to through your library. And so that's part of the reason why in the L developer preview we can no longer bind to services using an implicit intent. And so think about, okay, how can I help make sure that this communication channel is what it's supposed to be, and that somebody isn't intercepting communications, replacing my app, masquerading, otherwise trying to get in the way. And of course, there are things that are even higher order than that. Have a good reason for having the library in the first place. There should be a rationale for it. It is a product at the end of the day. It is something that you are putting your name to, your organization's name to in some cases. You're going to be needing to care and feed for this library over the long haul. And therefore, if you're going to the level of making it a library, there should be clear reasons why you want it now and why you are going to keep up after it over time. Just because you had an itch to scratch may not be a good reason for creating a whole library. Have a blog post, publish a gist or something, demonstrate how you solve a problem, but where that is clear from an expectation management standpoint that this isn't something that you are planning on supporting and maintaining and answering questions for until the end of time. Having a library because, hey, I can solve that, and that, again, if you're not going to be interested to maintain it, then don't go to the level of considering it a library, and that just make the information available elsewhere. And that in this case, it's more that something is wrong on the internet. Just because you can see a problem out there does not mean that that's a reason to write a library to solve it. And this, of course, meets the minimum requirement of XKCD content in my presentations. I'm bad at this. I frequently will see, oh, there's a problem, a pain point that somebody's experiencing. I can fix that. And I've published libraries that I didn't really have a good reason for. Yes, I could solve the problem, but I went to the level of making it a library that people were using and depending upon, and then if I didn't have a reason to consume the library myself, I wasn't eating my own dog food, I wasn't interested in necessarily expanding the library and continuing to do stuff with it. And so I'm as guilty of it as the next, and I've got less of an excuse. I got a 2,800-page book where I can put in sample code, and so I got plenty of ways of getting code out to people, and that to demonstrate how to solve problems. Which also means you need to think of the end-of-life scenarios as well. Libraries will not live forever. They are not, Mount Rushmore carved in granite. In an ideal world, between your organization or maybe an open source community, there's going to be a bunch of people who are going to be committed to working on this library and then into the indefinite future, and the cherubim and seraphim will sing, hallelujah. But that's only going to happen in some cases. Sometimes you can plan for deprecation. The classic example here is Jake Wharton with Action Bar Sherlock. Could Jake Wharton have created an action bar library that was a better action bar than Google's action bar, and therefore maybe would have gotten a long-term support scenario with a community trying to upgrade it and so forth over time? Sure. That wasn't his chosen scope. He wanted a strict backport. And therefore, it came with built-in deprecation. As soon as you can say in SDK version 15, or when Google finally released AppCompat, Action Bar Sherlock need becomes less. And so he announced early on, hey, you know, this is going to be deprecated at some point in time. And when the time was right, he said, 4.4 is it. That's the end, and that's the finis. And so if you're in a situation where that makes sense, you know that this library is going to become obsolete on a certain date or when certain criteria is met, publish it. Even if you don't intend this, but you find that, hey, I wrote that library and gosh, you know, I'm not really doing anything with that anymore. And, you know, deprecating. Ty talked about deprecating things at the method level. Deprecate things at the library level too. And that if you are not maintaining the library, don't make it seem like you're maintaining the library. Let people know the project is discontinued. Have the code out there so that if people want to play with it, they can, but make sure that it's obvious to the people who are seeing that code that yes, this is, you know, a memorial to a library that once lived. And it's not being maintained anymore, and therefore your mileage may vary. What you don't want to do is have a library that is out there and that people think that it is, you know, current and maintained and all that, and it's not. That's why you get advice on that from people saying, hey, you know, if there hasn't been a commit to the repo in a year, you need to start thinking about whether or not you should be using that library. That's because people aren't proactively deprecating the libraries, they are merely displaying them. Libraries, again, are products. They're things that you are publishing. Make sure there's reasons for them to exist, reasons for you to maintain them, and that are going to meet the needs of you, along with whoever your intended audience is. Android, we had a lousy reuse approaches in that in the early years. It's gotten loads better, and it's Gradle for Android, and that rolls out with better dependency support, and it's going to get even better. We're going to want more libraries, but we need quality as well as quantity. Not in terms of quality, or only in terms of quality, in terms of what you're providing, but in terms of how it's being maintained. Follow the leaders, but don't be that. And I have 2 minutes and 17 seconds, and that's for any questions. Question in the back, and speak loudly, please.
So I have an open source library, and people are trying to use it, but they will ping me on IM or email me with issues. And what is provide support? What do you have?
In case not everybody can hear that, the question is, what if users of your library contact you through channels that you prefer they not contact you through? They hit you up on Twitter, they find your email address and contact you by personal email, things like that. Generally speaking, what I tend to do is, particularly for the email side, is I will say, hey, you know, here's the official support channels. Provide at least a cursory level of assistance to try to maybe help them a bit, but definitely give them a strong nudge in the direction of whatever my official support channel is, usually Stack Overflow. Twitter, that gets a little bit more hairy just because you only got 140 characters to work with, but to the extent you can do the same sort of thing there, that's good. For your own sanity, you need to try to steer them in the direction of scalable support channels, but you know, to the extent you can help them too, and that's on the channel that they use, that's a win as well. Other questions? Stunned into silence. Okay, that's therefore a wrap for the presentation. Next up in this room, in theory, is somebody else talking about the Guardian Project for Crypto things. Thank you all for attending and enjoy the conference.